Welcome to the St. Joseph Institute webinar, 3x4, Multiplying Your LSL Tools. We'll begin by introducing ourselves. I'm Susan Segal, the lead speech-language pathologist at St. Joseph Institute.
I'm Terry Willett, director at St. Joseph Institute, and a deaf educator and an early interventionist. Both Susan and I hold certification as listening and spoken language specialists through the A.G. Bell Academy for Listening and Spoken Language. Let's begin with a little housekeeping. This is a recorded webinar, so you will not be able to ask questions live, but you will be able to go back and watch portions again. We recommend that you keep paper handy to write down any comments or questions as you go. If they're not answered during the webinar itself, we've set aside time to discuss them when you come to the live and in-person session at St. Joseph on June 18th. Please note that there are several documents attached as handouts. You may find it helpful to print them out in advance, especially the PowerPoint, as it has more detail for notes than the one you'll be seeing displayed in the webinar.
Let's begin by discussing the terms listening and spoken language and auditory verbal. The terms auditory verbal and listening and spoken language can be used synonymously. The certification is even termed Listening and Spoken Language Specialist AV-Ed or Listening and Spoken Language Specialist AVT. So don't let the terms get you confused as we move forward. AV therapy is actually very complicated, and much more complicated than just talking. It requires a strong understanding of many areas, including but not limited to auditory function and development, speech acoustics, auditory assessment, and amplification options. For this training, we are not starting at the beginning, and we certainly won't cover even a fraction of the necessary knowledge base for listening and spoken language practice. However, we do assume that you have a basic understanding of auditory skill development and speech acoustics. We are including documents for your reference and suggest that if you are not familiar with them, you consider further training in this area. The basic premise of listening and spoken language therapy is that we can learn to listen better, that listening is effectively a skill that can be built like any other skill. Once it is built, it can be used effectively to learn spoken language. Another premise is that we generally say what we hear, that a child's spoken productions usually reflect the quality of what they hear. Given this foundation, we can begin to address building a child's listening skill set by assessing their vocalization and speech production and adjusting their auditory experience to progressively build their listening skills.
There are two basic aspects to consider in habilitation. The first is pedagogical. How do we approach what we're going to do from a teaching point of view? What tools will we use? It might help to compare it to a more familiar process, such as coaching or physical therapy. Most of us have had some experience with the process of coaching along with physical therapy. When an athlete is recovering from an injury, the job of the physical therapist has several aspects. First, the therapist needs to pinpoint what muscle is not functioning correctly and whether anything can be done to directly address the problem. Is it a torn tendon or ligament? They have to identify the underlying problem, and addressing it directly is the first step. Some listening and spoken language techniques, such as the LING assessments, are designed to help us pinpoint what aspect of sound is not fully accessible so that we can address it directly through amplification adjustments. The next step is to build the strength of the identified muscle, but often in the absence of one muscle function, we've learned to compensate for it, oftentimes even in ways that are less effective and may inhibit our ability to use the muscle we're targeting. Likewise, in the absence of some auditory access, children will compensate with other kinds of cues. Sometimes those cues work, but often they can be misleading and inhibit the development of what can be a more effective auditory information. So we manipulate the environment to help isolate the auditory skill. We do that through screening, hand cues, or positioning. Next, we actually have to build the strength of that muscle and finally retrain the body to use it comprehensively in concert with the other joints and muscles. To do that, the physical therapist assesses how strong the muscle is and gradually increases the load it has to carry with lots of practice. As it strengthens, the coach and the physical therapist increase the load, constantly assessing for signs of strain and adjusting the practice to compensate. All along, the PT is watching the practical use of that muscle and movement to support its normal function. The same thing happens with listening skills. We practice them in easy situations. Then, as they are mastered, we make the situation more challenging and coordinate it with other aspects of communication. We use the skill to build language and speech, constantly watching for when and how the skill might break down, and adjusting to give practice to build it up again. The listening and spoken language techniques of acoustic highlighting and auditory sandwiching are used for those purposes. So the first basic techniques we're focusing on here are the LING assessments, positioning and covering, acoustic highlighting, and auditory sandwiching.
The second basic aspect to consider is structure. What skills do we need to address and in what order? If we look at this slide and consider building a house, we know that we have to start with the foundation to support the structure. And we need to follow this by framing the house and then finally putting on the roof. Likewise, all of us as teachers or therapists know that skills need to be built in a more or less sequential developmental order. We're watching for overall auditory skills to move along what we would consider a typical developmental sequence. So when we look at the developmental sequence of auditory skill development, we frequently refer to the model developed by Norm Erber in 1977. In this model, Norm has presented a hierarchy or a continuum of skills that a child progresses through in level of difficulty. The easiest stage is detection, and in this stage, the child must detect or identify the presence versus absence of sound. The next skill is to be able to identify how a sound is different from another. This is called discrimination. Then we learn to identify the sound identification. And finally, we need to assign meaning to what we heard, and this is called comprehension. One of the ways to think of this is if we assign different phrases to the levels of auditory skill development. For example, we may think of detection as, I hear it, discrimination as, I hear something different, identification, I know what I hear, and comprehension, I know what that means. All of the LSL techniques we are going to be learning can be applied to these different levels of auditory development, depending on the level of the student.
So we're going to look at the specific tools in our LSL Toolbox and some different ways to use them. One of the best LSL techniques evaluates access to the speech spectrum, the equivalent of the physical therapist identifying where the weaknesses are, but in auditory skills. We hope that you're familiar with the LING test. The assessment was designed by Dan LING to be a functional assessment of equipment and of hearing. Originally, it consisted of just 5 sounds, but some versions now contain as many as 8. We're going to refer to the version we currently use, the 6-sound test. It includes ah, ooh, e, sh, and s. We also include the distractor of nothing or no sounds. These 6 sounds span the speech spectrum from low frequency with the nasal murmur of to high frequency, the voiceless s. The basic test is designed to deliver at normal speech volume in quiet from about 3 feet away. Most deaf educators have used the LING sounds to assess hearing aid function and perhaps to do a quick check on a child's hearing in a classroom. But LINGs can be used to provide some very specific assessment information that will help us with that first step in the habilitation process, identifying the weaknesses in a child's access. Specifically, we're going to look at 3 aspects of LING for children: assessing detection, assessing identification, and assessing access in noise and across distances.
One of the very first skills we look at with very young children is establishing to what degree they can detect sound in the speech spectrum. Early audiological assessments give us some reliable information, but the very best amplification results come from combining these assessments with live booth testing that involves a child's clear conditioned response. Detection is typically taught to children 12 to 24 months of age, as it tracks clearly with the development of cause and effect. However, children who have new, variable, or questionable access to sound, such as a child with a new cochlear implant or a child with a Mondini malformation, they may have more difficulty recognizing and responding to the sounds they hear. Note, at this point in time, we don't expect a child to identify which sound they hear, only that they hear something. Many therapists are tempted to use environmental sounds such as drums or sound toys to teach detection. While they may be helpful in initial play to establish the relationship between sounds and their sources, because their volume and pitch is so unpredictable and because the sounds they make have minimal relationship to speech and language, moving to speech sounds as soon as possible is much more functional.
So now we're going to take a look at our first set of clips. First, I just want to say this. We all strongly felt that it was necessary to include video clips of the LSL tools to help make the process clearer to you. From past experience, we knew this would be no easy matter. Most of the time, LSL's therapists and teachers move fluidly from one tool to the other, and the choice of which tool you're going to use with any child in any given session is made on the fly, not easily predicted for video purposes. We did our best to capture clear examples of specific techniques, but in review we can definitely tell we are not video professionals, and we can see plenty of errors in our own therapy sessions. We hope that the clips are clear and loud enough for you to understand the process, and we promise to give you much better live examples when you get on campus on the 18th. In these first 3 videos, you're going to see early examples of teaching detection with LING sounds. In the first clip, Kelly is working with a young new listener to establish clear conditioned responses to the LING sounds. You'll note that the child is repeating some of them. In order to be sure that she is teaching response to clear stimuli, Kelly is using her hand to block her mouth, but her examples of LING sounds are longer and have more inflection in order to assist in early training. However, you can see that the little girl is responding with ease to the speech sounds. In the second video, you see a very different situation. You see 2 therapists, Kristen and Caitlin, working with a much more challenging child. This little girl has a cochlear implant, but she also has a rather severe Mondini malformation, and she's had a good deal of difficulty in both detection and early identification. Kristen and Caitlin are using an error-free strategy to help her begin to differentiate between 2 LING sounds at a time. In the last video of this set, you see a little bit older child, but with relatively recent implant. You'll see him working with Susan through detection, and eventually you're going to see some more clips that also show identification and imitation of the LING sounds. We hope you enjoy these clips.
Good job! Yay! Put it in. It goes here.
I think your battery's died out.
Ready? Listen. Listen. Listen, you gotta wait. Ready? Good job. Put it in. It goes here. Here. Yay! Ready? Listen. You heard it, didn't you? Good job. She's in.
Okay. You ready? Listen. Whoops. Sorry. He goes. Okay, listen. Okay, listen. Ooh. Ooh. Listen. Listen. Ooh. Ooh. Okay, listen. Ooh. Yeah. Ooh.
There goes the tractor. Let's do the horse. Nay. Ready? E. E. Listen. Listen, wait. E. Good job. Here we go. Mm. Mm. Did you hear it? You did. You said it. Yeah, let's put the chicken in. Good job. Oh, I think it goes right there. Awesome. Ooh. Listen. Ooh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the cow. The cow says moo. Yeah, a cow says moo. Mm-hmm. Ready?
Note that during training, we may vary the pitch, length, or volume of the delivery of the LING sounds to help the child understand the task. But the goal is to deliver the sounds eventually consistently at a normal speaking volume, have each sound delivered about 1 second, maybe 2 seconds at the most in length, and with flat pitch or no pitch variation. It's also important to ensure that the child is not using other cues to compensate for their hearing, and we'll discuss that issue in detail later when we talk about positioning and covering.
With consistent responses, we know that the child can detect sounds across the spectrum, but we don't know if they all sound the same or how they might sound different. Identifying the differences between the sounds helps us to know what frequencies are clearly perceived and which ones might be missing or confusing. So the next step is to identify the LING 6 sounds. We get the most feedback when the child repeats the sound back to us. Since we believe that children say what they hear, the repetition of the sound allows us to evaluate the quality of the speech sounds they hear. In a case where we are not sure of the child's physical or developmental ability to repeat the sound, we can substitute by teaching them to identify a picture or object that corresponds with the sound. However, often children start off right away by repeating the sound, so we would encourage that as a superior response for assessment purposes. If we need to use pictures or objects, typically we would pair them like this. For the ah sound, we would use an airplane. Ooh would be a ghost or a cow. A mouse or a slide might be used to represent E, while ice cream cone might represent Sh could be represented by a sleeping child, and S or S as a snake. There are a number of sources for pictures. Here's an example that's actually available on an app. Again, we want to know how the child differentiates the acoustic spectrum of each sound. So it is very important that we move to identification with clean productions of the sound. We know that production can vary a lot from person to person in pitch, length, and volume, or in suprasegmental features. So we need to keep these aspects as flat and as similar as possible. We may vary them to some extent to make training more interesting, but once we move to assessment, we need to stop and keep them consistent. Also note that at the identification stage, it is very important to deliver the sounds in an unpredictable sequence. One of the reasons why we want to do this is because there are only 6 sounds, and that represents a closed set. These children can be very bright, so because it is a closed set of 6 sounds, some children will use process of elimination, so they may be able to guess which sound is going to occur next. It is also important that the sounds be presented at varying time intervals. As soon as a child has the concept of negation or absence, the term nothing should be used to indicate that they didn't hear anything. This is essential to establishing confidence that they hear high frequencies. As bright children will often assume that a long silence indicates that you presented an S or a S sound, whether they heard it or not. Varying time intervals is also important because children need to learn to wait between stimulus that are presented, and this helps them prepare for booth testing, as it helps eliminate some of the false positive responses.
So in these next 2 clips, you see Susan working with this little boy through the process of identifying the sounds by associating them with objects. As he is learning which object represents which sound, he's already imitating the sounds back, allowing us to assess the quality of his productions and thus his perception of the sounds. In the following clip, you can see he's imitating quite well already.
Oh, sorry. Moo. Moo. It's the cow. You want to feel it? You want to? Moo. That's the cow. Walk, walk, walk. Okay. Ready? So put it right there. Listen. Ah. Ah. Okay. Ready? Let's listen. Okay. Ah. Which one is it? Good job. That's the airplane. We'll do it in a minute. Okay? Let's do a few more. Ready? Here we go. Ah. Yay, the airplane. Okay. One more. Moo. Moo. That's the cow. Walk, walk, walk. Look, the cow's walking. Oh, cow's back. Ready? Shall we do it? Okay. Round and round. Round and round. There it goes. It's gonna roll. Oh, oh, let it roll. Oh. and do a somersault. Stop. Stop. Oh. Let's do a few more. Listen. Let's do a few more. Move. Move. E. Sh. Ah. Ooh. Mm. Mm. Good job. Awesome. All done.
We'll do that tomorrow.
As children have mastered detection at 3 feet, and definitely by the time they have learned to identify the LINGs, you should vary the distance at which they are presented. The acoustic rule is that every time you double the distance, from 3 to 6 feet for example, you lose 6 dB in intensity of the sound. Inversely, every time you halve the distance, from 3 to 1.5 feet for example, you add 6 dB of intensity. This is important because 6 dB of intensity can fall across a child's hearing threshold. For example, a child might be able to detect and identify an S or S at 3 feet consistently, but when you move to 6 feet, the loss of the 6 dB of intensity means that they can no longer detect it. So in order to teach an S sound or S in a word, or to use it as a grammatical marker in a plural or a possessive, you need to stay within 3 feet of the child. That's hard to do with a 2-year-old. This is one of the main arguments for using an FM system to eliminate the distance effect from the child's learning experience. It is important to establish the distance at which a child can identify LINGs consistently as soon as possible. The distance becomes a threshold of sorts for their typical hearing levels. Sometimes it varies from sound to sound. And vowels might be at 12 feet, while S, S, and SH, sh, are only at 6 feet. Knowing their typical responses can help you pinpoint when hearing might change or when a device is not working properly. For example, if a child usually identifies S or S at 12 feet and suddenly can't detect it from 3 feet, you can assume that there is a loss of high-frequency access due to a middle ear infection, a progressive hearing loss, or a problem with the amplification device. For this reason, LINGs should always be done separately on each ear.
We worked really hard on the next few clips. The problem was capturing the process on video when the therapist and the child were so far apart. In the first clip, you will see that the little girl can detect an S, S from 6 feet with ease, but then can't hear it at all at double the distance. When we decrease the distance again, she's inconsistent, but she finally gets it. Her threshold for hearing the S sound is right at about 5 or 6 feet. It's surprising to note that most children with cochlear implants and without an FM system can detect and identify an S produced at normal intensity in a quiet environment from more than 30 feet away. In the second clip, you're going to see a young man identify all the LING sounds from more than 20 feet. He's nearly as accurate at double that distance. We just couldn't get it on camera. So here you go.
Okay.
E, sh, oo, s, We're gonna do it again. Stay there. We're gonna do it again. Ooh, e, s, sh, s, Listen. Ooh. S. E.
One side off, please. Okay, here we go.
S. Nothing. E.
Because of the distance children can hear with their implants alone, it can be very difficult to use LINGs to assess the function of an FM system. Be certain that there is sufficient distance or some kind of barrier to prevent normal hearing through their regular implant before you test with the FM. It might require 2 people or some clever manipulation of the circumstances to test the FM appropriately. So here's our best shot at capturing what it can take to do LINGs with an FM system. Obviously, this is an older student who can handle standing far away from the teacher, but the same kind of process would be necessary to assess the boy you saw do his LINGs with his implant from 20 feet. So you might need another person to help with this process. You're going to see here the young lady explain how her process works and what the issues are in the first clip. And then in the second clip, you get to see her repeating all her LINGs from quite a distance. The teacher's not in the clip because she's too far away for you to see her. All right? Here you go.
Do you remember what I need to do if I'm checking your FM?
Ensure that they're both synced.
Yes. And then what?
Be sure they're working.
Yes. And then what do I need to do though? So I sat here and you were over there, which is about 15 feet away. Long time doing this. And I know that this, what does this do for you?
Helps me hear better.
How?
Like, it helps me, like, if someone's far on the other side of the room, and a lot of people are talking, and they're talking in the chat, I can hear them.
You can still hear them, right? So what, can I sit right here and know that you hearing me do the LINGs is going to be just through your FM? Or do your implants also pick that sound up? Both. Yep. So what do I need to do?
Do the rings without one.
Nope. Because I already did them without the FM. I'm going to do them with the FM, but where do I need to be?
On the other side of the room.
On the other side of the room. Yep, absolutely. So I'm going to have you go stand over by the pencil sharpener again. Okay. And I'm going to go to the farthest corner. That's exactly right. All right, let's do your left ear first.
Nothing.
Now that we have assessed the weaknesses in the child's auditory skills, we want to be sure that we are isolating the skills appropriately so that we can work on them. Children who are early in their listening experiences have often learned to compensate by watching for a variety of visual cues. While those cues may serve them well in many aspects of the general environment, it can confuse the assessment process and even conflict with the auditory skill that they're trying to master. So like the physical therapist isolating a particular muscle to strengthen it, we need to control the other signals to assess and focus on the auditory response alone. We can use a speech hoop or the hand cue for that purpose. We should note that covering and the hand cue are among the most obvious of the LSL tools and often the most misunderstood and overused. In some contexts, they are essential, but once learned, we often use them much too often, when general positioning is a much better tool.
In our last section, we talked about teaching a child to detect and identify LING sounds. It can be amazing to see how effectively children can interpret even the most subtle and disjointed aspects of facial movement to identify a specific speech sound in a closed set of 6. The slight movement of the chin, cheek, eyebrows, or hairline can cue a child as to whether you are producing an ah or an e. However, depending on the developmental level of a child, it can be essential for you to be close and maintain eye contact. So how to solve this problem? Let's find out. You can cover your face. Seriously, covering can be essential to totally isolating the auditory signal and still deliver it from a close distance, especially in assessments of speech perception such as the LINGs. However, many covers will actually distort the speech sound, so a better choice would be a speech hoop. A speech or listening hoop is simply a piece of acoustically neutral material stretched across a hoop of metal, wood, or plastic. You can make one easily with the cloth used to cover speakers and an embroidery hoop, but you can also get them from some cochlear implant companies.
So in this next clip, you see a preschool teacher with a class of 4 or 5 children. She can't easily move around, and she needs to isolate those signals to focus just on audition. She's a real pro at using that speech hoop.
Instead. Josiah, did you want to get the cups? Tell me. I want the cups. What? I want the cups. You're saying, I want the cups. I want the cups. I want the cups. Good. You may go get the cups. You said, I want the cups. Will you go get them? Go get them. Get the cups.
Okay, so we can see how useful covering can be in assessment and even in training, but there are a bunch of problems. First of all, I don't carry a speech hoop in my back pocket, and some kids may even find the speech hoop scary or intimidating. It gets in the way of seamless assessment and teaching, and it makes communication look unnatural. So what are my alternatives? We can replace the speech hoop with your hand. Always, if your hand is always attached, everyone has one, and it's not too scary. It is also easy to incorporate into sessions. Your hand can do a great job of quickly obscuring visual cues about the perception of a speech sound. It's also easy to switch from covering with your hand to using it as a microphone prop to encourage imitation in a speech exchange.
The problem is your hand is not acoustically neutral. It will change the intensity and acoustic properties of the sounds you're producing. So you need to be careful how you use it. We recommend holding it about 4 to 8 inches from your mouth between you and the student with your fingers separated in a natural manner. That will obscure visual cues with minimal acoustic distortion. In the next clip, you're going to see Susan using the hand cue with a student. It's much more subtle than the use of a hoop, and we often use it combined with other techniques and tools. Susan uses a really great example of a very controlled hand cue for cover. She only uses it when it's needed, and she uses perfect technique.
She's smelling. She's smelling a flower. She's smelling flower. Not when. Running. Running. Who's running? Well, tell me. He's running. Good. Both of the previous solutions are relatively easy to use, but they still look and feel unnatural, and you don't run across them much in real life. Maybe on Halloween or winter, but not very often. The more natural solution is to simply manipulate your position relative to the child. Sitting next to them or behind them, holding them on your lap, or standing above them presents a much more natural situation that emulates real-life listening and still obscures additional visual cues, isolating the auditory skill in question. It has the added advantage of easily allowing you to manipulate the distance between you, the sound source, and the child's microphone during the assessment process. Positioning doesn't always work, though. Some children need eye contact to stay focused, or need a hand cue to help them develop turn-taking and imitation skills. Or you may simply be stuck in a position that won't allow you to change it, like in a classroom where a horseshoe table is used in front of a group of students. But the more skill you have in managing position, the more natural the child's rehabilitation will be.
So this next clip is a great example of managing auditory access by positioning. Jen is the teacher, and she moves to stand above and behind her student to model in a very natural way using no cover at all. Notice in the clip how she changes position to get closer to a student, to model a sentence that's harder to hear, and still doesn't need to cover because she's just manipulated her position.
Let's go talk to Brandon. Oh, you have to say his name first. Brandon. Do you want a cup?
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Oh, Dion. Slow down. Do you want a cup? Come on. Yes, please. Thank you.
So hopefully now we've identified where the weaknesses are for the child and how we can isolate the auditory signal to be sure that we're practicing auditory skills alone. The next question is, how do we strengthen those skills? Exercise that particular muscle, so to speak. A physical therapist might start with an easy task, just straightening a knee, and then add more and more weight to build strength over time. We're going to make the listening task progressively easier and harder by manipulating the way we present the speech sounds in easier and harder situations. The process is called acoustic highlighting. There are many aspects of acoustic highlighting, but the important thing to remember is this. Like any technique meant to build a skill, the key is knowing when to make it harder and when to make it easier. A skilled coach or physical therapist will increase the distance of the run or the weight carried with a careful eye, knowing just when to make the task easier, when to make it harder, and when to change it up. Note that there are several other ways to practice acoustic highlighting, and many of them are easily combined, so much so that it can be really hard to see them in isolation. There are many acoustic highlighting techniques, including manipulating volume, speed, precision of articulation, how far away you're standing from the child, how many times you repeat something, and many more. All of them make a varied coaching toolbox to build strength and auditory skills. For this webinar, we're going to focus on just 3 ways to vary acoustic input. First is volume or emphasis, then pausing or changing word order, and finally the process of low lighting.
Once we know that a child has difficulty hearing a particular speech sound under certain conditions, we can attend to that in daily learning or therapeutic situations. For example, a common goal for children with hearing loss is using a final S to mark plural nouns. We have already assessed exactly what distance the child can hear S, so we know that he has easy acoustic access to the sound at up to 12 feet. However, we know that competing sounds in a classroom might actually compromise that access. So if the child doesn't use the sound in a sentence like, he has 5 caps, we can help him hear it better by adding emphasis to that final S, increasing the volume or length of the production. For example, he has 5 caps. Another common example would be a child who leaves out articles. We know from the LINGs that he can hear ah, and therefore likely as well. But the lack of emphasis in a running sentence may make it hard to access. So we would highlight it as, I got a new baseball mitt. Clearly, we don't want the acoustic highlighting to become a constant crutch. And in our final LSL tool, Auditory Sandwiching, we will look at ways to avoid that. But when a child is first becoming aware of a speech sound, when and where it occurs, and what meaning it conveys, acoustic highlighting can be helpful. Remember that acoustic highlighting is making the acoustic practice easier. So like good coaches, we don't want to do that for too long. Be sure to make it harder over time.
In this next clip, Caitlin is using emphasis to help a young man hear the word he's missing in a sentence. You're going to have to watch and listen very carefully because she inserts it very subtly. But you can definitely hear how she's emphasizing a word that he needs to hear in the middle of a sentence.
What are you going to do?
Open.
What do you want to do?
Open red door.
Okay. I want to open the red door.
I want to open red door.
Oh, you're so close. You're missing one little word. Don't forget the red door.
Open the red door.
Good. I want to open the red door.
I want open.
Okay.
Another thing that can make the acoustic perception of the sounds in a word difficult is its position in the sentence. Words and sounds at the beginning and ending of a sentence are easier to perceive than those that are scrunched in the middle. In our earlier example of perceiving the S or S sound in the sentence, he has 5 caps, the targeted sound was at the end. But if the sentence had been, he put his caps in the car, it would be harder to perceive that S in caps because it blends into the middle of the sentence. When you can, moving a key word to the beginning or ending of a phrase or sentence can help. When you can't syntactically move the word, you can artificially create a sort of end by pausing just briefly after the target word. He put his caps in the car. Pausing before or after a key word is often combined with emphasis to assist even more. Remember, Coach, we don't want to keep the task easier forever. Conversely, we want to make it harder by intentionally placing target words in the middle of a sentence and speaking more quickly.
We're going to see Caitlin again, and you can see her using pausing and reordering to pull out the important word that this little boy needs to hear. You might notice that she finishes her presentation using the next tool we're going to study, the auditory sandwich. So keep your eyes open.
Put the rabbits beside the box.
Beside? Just beside?
Okay. Sit down. You put one rabbit. Listen again, okay? Where are the rabbits? Good. So listen. Put the rabbits beside the box. Good job. High five. What's left?
Lowlighting is an acoustic trick to help children perceive soft, high-frequency sounds. There are several sounds in English speech that are pronounced without voicing and thus have less intensity and higher pitch. These include P, T, K, S, SH, H, CH, F, and TH. When these sounds are produced next to a noisy voiced vowel, as they usually are, it makes them especially hard to perceive, and early listeners often struggle to hear and produce them correctly. Sometimes they will voice the sound, turning pat into bad. Other times they may omit it, turning key into e. To make the task of perceiving voiceless sounds easier, we can simply reduce the volume of the vowel by whispering. Whispering basically produces a vowel without the intensity of normal voice. Listen to the contrast. Pat versus pat. Whispered again, pat versus pat. Without the volume of the intermediate vowel, the P and T are much easier to hear. Now we know that whispering is not an obvious technique to use with children who have hearing loss. Most people think it sounds crazy, and we should be talking louder, not softer, right? But this particular technique is one of the most effective ways to help children initially perceive voiceless sounds, and it is incredibly effective. We also end up with some kids who can really whisper well.
So in this next clip, we see Caitlin again with the same little guy. He's struggling to hear the K sound in the word key, and she's helping him by whispering the sound so that he can hear the K without the intensity of the E sound as key. Okay?
Okay, what else do you want to do to the door?
Ring bell.
Tell me the whole thing.
I want ring bell.
I want to ring
I want to ring a bell.
the bell. I want to ring the bell. All right, ring the bell. Ooh, what do you think about that bell?
Ding dong, ding dong.
Ding dong, ding dong, ding.
Mock, mock, mock,
Oh, I'm hearing mock again.
mock, mock, mock.
Good job, you fixed it. I like that. High five. It's a knock, knock, knock on that purple door.
Open, eek.
I need
Eek,
key.
eek.
Key. Good. You need the key. All right.
The last Lissel's technique we're going to address is the yummiest, the auditory sandwich. This technique is another new idea that's basically applying good old teaching strategies in a new way. It refers to the process of presenting a new or challenging item, the bottom of the bun, going back to provide whatever support is necessary to help the child understand or produce it, the meat in the middle, and then finishing with a final model that reinforces the child's understanding in a more complete way, the top of the bun. When you think about it, you have seen and used some aspect of the technique in many teaching scenarios. To learn a foreign language, you present the new word, sombrero, and then clarify that it's a fancy hat. Then you go back to the word sombrero. It makes a nice sombrero sandwich. You would never settle for the word hat, but would always return to model the target sombrero, the concept you want to leave the child with, the actual goal. In Lissel's technique, we use the auditory sandwich in a variety of ways. It makes a great partner to acoustic highlighting. present the potentially difficult target, help out by highlighting it, and then return to the unhighlighted target presentation. From an acoustic point of view, we might help the child out in many ways, but we always want to close by at least letting them listen to the more mature model, even if they can't produce it yet. We're going to talk about 3 auditory sandwiches you should have on your menu. The first is using visual or other kinds of information to clarify what you're talking about. The second is chunking language in order to produce it in smaller pieces. And the third is expanding or finishing off your acoustic sandwich with even more information.
One way to use an auditory sandwich with an early learner is to offer new information, pause to explain it with whatever information or visual supports are necessary, and then return to the auditory information again. Here's an example. We saw a lion. Do you remember the lion? It says roar, roar. And we can show a picture or use a sign, etc. And then we want to finish with, that's right, we saw a lion. We started and finished with the target sentence and vocabulary word. We saw a lion. And in between we added whatever was necessary for the child to understand the target. A picture, an object, a written word, a sign, the target word in his native language, whatever is needed for comprehension. But the key was we didn't stop with the additional comprehension piece. We returned to the language model we were targeting. Even if the child can't yet produce the full model, we want to be sure that they leave with the clear model given appropriately.
In this next clip, you're going to see Kristen working with a 3-year-old on identifying spondee words. She introduces the word, gives him all kinds of help to make sure he knows what it is, and then she finishes with a typical production of the word, the perfect sandwich.
Toothbrush, 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 toothbrush. Listen, listen. Don't look. Look. Toothbrush. Yeah, look. Brush, brush, brush. Yeah, it's a toothbrush.
As children's speech grows, we begin to target longer and longer sentences. Sometimes their auditory memory can't manage all the information at once. When that happens, we could just target shorter sentences. But that would make us bad coaches, willing to settle for 100 yards instead of pushing for that half-mile run. So what we do is model the full sentence as it should be used, then give them the meat of the sentence broken up into manageable syntactic chunks, and finish with the bun of the model of the full sentence. Here's an example. We're going to model how this might happen in a teaching exchange. After we went to the park, we stopped to get ice cream. That was the first bun. Now here comes the meat. After we went to the park, we stopped to get ice cream. And now we'll finish with the final bun. Right. After we went to the park, we stopped to get ice cream. Please note that we broke the sentence into syntactically meaningful chunks. It is not so good to model after we went to the park, we stopped to get ice cream. Even though a child's best performance might be at the 1 to 2 word level, chunking should always be based on syntax that makes sense.
In this next clip, you see Kristen again working with another young man. In the process, you're going to see her use a model of very nice chunked sentence.
The girl is pushing the boy.
Yeah.
Your turn. The girl is...
Boy,
The girl
that's
is pushing
a verse.
the baby.
A baby.
The girl is pushing the baby.
Yeah.
Our last LSL tool involves finishing off the sandwich with a croissant instead of a bun. As coaches, we just can never be satisfied. So when a child has done a good job, maybe a better job than we expected, of managing the meat in the sandwich, we want to push one tiny step further by using expansion for our final bun. We might add another aspect we want the child to process, or change out a familiar vocabulary word with a new one to help expand their lexicon. Now, we wouldn't do this much if the child is really struggling with that meat. We don't want to overload or frustrate them, but let's say the child in the last example was able to handle chunking like this with ease. We're going to model how this might happen in a teaching exchange. After we went to the park, we stopped to get ice cream. After we went to the park, we stopped to get ice cream. Then we might finish with an extra flourish. Right, after we went to the park, we stopped to get chocolate ice cream cones. Or, after we went to the park, we did stop to get ice cream. Or, yes, after we went to the park, Daddy drove to get gelato. The variations are endless, and the process helps children in two ways. First, it repeats the basic structure of the language to increase their understanding of the underlying syntax. Second, it emphasizes how we can manipulate the building blocks of language to change what we say, avoiding many of our students' false idea that language is static or predetermined. Again, you can combine LSL tools in so many ways. Let's look at combining acoustic highlighting and an auditory sandwich, with expansion at a simpler level with our earlier sandwich about a lion. For example, a teaching exchange may occur like this. We saw the lion.
We see lion.
We saw the lion.
We see the lion.
Right, we saw a big lion at the zoo.
In this last clip, you see Jen with a class of preschoolers. Note how she introduces the one-word answer she's seeking from the beginning listener. She uses all kinds of techniques to help him say it, but then she finishes it with an expanded sentence, adding not only the right way to say the word, but two full sentence structures to surround it.
Show your friends. What did you make? What is that? Listen. Play.
Play.
A. Play. Dough. Play-Doh. You made Play-Doh. Stop. We made Play-Doh together.
We hope you found this webinar to be helpful. It's intended to be an introduction to the use of these skills with actual real-life students when you come on campus in the next week or so. Please feel free to go back and watch the clips or the entire webinar again if you like. Remember, it will only be available to you until June 17th. While this webinar is recorded so you can't interact with us immediately, be sure to jot down any questions to bring to us on the 18th. We've set aside time to discuss the techniques, address questions, and look at ways you can expand and apply them to the students on your caseload. We'll see you then.